Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Dale McGee, and tonight I'm representing both the Boston Medical Library and the Worcester District Medical Society. This combined presentation came about because last winter we scheduled Rosemary Gibson for in-person presentations in Boston and in Worcester this week. But then COVID-19 happened. We felt that offering an online presentation would get this important information out. In fact, this medium is reaching far more people than we would had we just had the in-person conferences. The Boston Medical Library dates back to the 19th century, and over the years has come to possess one of the most valuable collections of antique medical books and artifacts in the world. In addition to this resource, we provide lectures on health policy, public health, and medical history. Tonight's presentation is the Garland Lecture, named for past New England Journal of Medicine editor and Boston Medical Library past president Joseph Garland. The Worcester District Medical Society dates back to 1794 and currently serves over 2,000 members. This presentation is also the Cottle Lecture, named in honor of Lewis Cottle, who was a member of the society and practiced at the Worcester Emergency Hospital from 1902 until his death in 1950. Through his generosity, a trust was established that underwrites a substantial portion of the Medical Society's expenses. I would like to thank the members of the selection committees of both organizations for helping with this, as well as Martha Wright and Melissa Boucher of the Worcester Medical Society, Tara Peeler of the Boston Medical Library, and Dana Muir and her team at the Massachusetts Medical Society. Our topic this evening, the repercussions of outsourcing our pharmaceuticals to China, is one that everyone involved in healthcare should be aware of, and yet few of us are. Most of us assume that the safety and quality that we have come to expect from an industry that is overseen by the FDA holds regardless of where the factory is located. Few of us are aware of the multiple layers involved in the manufacture of drugs, including raw materials, and the industries that use terms like excipients, which is a term I had never heard until I became more involved with this topic. We are lucky to have a national expert to explain this to us and a panel of local experts to enrich the discussion. Please feel free to put questions in by using the question icon at the bottom of your screen, and we will address as many as we can at the end of the presentation. Those of you who will be applying for continuing medical education credits can expect to be contacted by the Massachusetts Medical Society to complete your application. We have here a list of learning objectives for the continuing medical education of this course, this lecture. And we also have disclosure statements that are mandated in association with presentations such as this. There's a lot to read here, and if you're interested in the details, there will be a video available of this presentation, and you can review this in more detail there. Now I would like to turn it over to Dr. Mary O'Brien. Mary is an internist in Shrewsbury with the UMass Memorial Medical Group and chair of the Worcester District Medical Society's Medical Education Committee. She will introduce our speakers. Take it over, Mary.
Thank you, Dr. McGee. Good evening, everyone. Before I introduce our featured speaker tonight, on behalf of the Worcester District Medical Society and the Boston Medical Library, I would like to take this opportunity to recognize and thank Dr. Dale McGee for being the mastermind behind this event tonight. Dale spent countless hours and exchanged hundreds of emails over the course of the past 9 months to carefully orchestrate this presentation that we bring to you tonight. So thank you very much, Dr. McGee. And now we are honored to have Rosemary Gibson as our featured speaker. Rosemary is an award-winning author, inspirational speaker, and advisor to organizations that advance the public's interest in healthcare. A national authority on healthcare reform, Medicare, patient safety, and overtreatment in medicine, she has written several critically acclaimed books. She is the 2014 recipient of the highest honor from the American Medical Writers Association for her outstanding contributions to the field of medical communication. Her writing has given voice to public's interest in critical healthcare issues of the day. Rosemary is senior advisor at the Hastings Center and author of China RX, Exposing the Risk of America's Dependence on China for Medicines. She testified before the House Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee in October 2019 on this topic. While at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Rosemary was chief architect of its $200 million national strategy to establish inpatient palliative care programs that now number 1,600, an increase from about 10 in 1990s. She received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Academy of Hospice at Palliative Medicine. She also worked with Bill Moyers on the PBS documentary, On Our Own Terms. Rosemary has given presentations and grand rounds on patient safety at hundreds of hospitals, keynoted meetings of the National Quality Forum, the Joint Commission, A1, National Council of State Boards of Nursing, Federation of State Medical Boards, to just name a few. She speaks to public audiences at diverse venues such as the New York Public Library, the AARP National Convention, George Mason University, the Women's National Democratic Club, to name just a few. She speaks to state policymakers at the National Council of State Legislators and the National Academy of State Health Policy. Her books have been reviewed in Publishers Weekly, Washington Post, Journal of the American Medical Association, and Health Affairs, referenced in proceedings of the U.S. Senate, mentioned in congressional testimony, as well as in major journals and newspapers. Rosemary has appeared on Chicago Tonight, WGBH's Greater Boston, Fox News, The Doctors, and C-SPAN Book TV. Her books have received international acclaim. Wall of Silence was translated into Japanese, and the Chinese translation of Treatment Trap won the prestigious Open Book Award from China Times. Earlier in her career, Gibson was a senior associate at the American Enterprise Institute, vice president of the Economic and Social Research Institute, a policy think tank, and consultant to the Medical College of Virginia and the Virginia State's Legislature Commission on Healthcare. She also served as a volunteer and board member at a free medical clinic in Washington, D.C. Ms. Gibson will be presenting our keynote lecture this evening. Upon completion of her talk, I will then introduce three of our regional local expert panelists who will give their brief commentary, and then we'll open it up to the discussion to the audience with a Q&A session. So please be sure, as Dr. McGee said, to type your questions in. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rosemary Gibson as our keynote speaker, who will present tonight's topic, Dependence on China for Medicines, Implications for Drug Shortages, Recalls, and Health Security. Welcome, Rosemary.
Thank you so much, Dr. O'Brien and Dr. McGee and all of you affiliated with the Boston Medical Library and the Worcester District Medical Society. It's truly a real privilege for me to be here with you this evening. What I'd like to do now is to just share my screen and slides, and we will jump right in. Just a little background. People have asked me how I got interested in this subject matter. And it was a topic that I was looking to write another book, and I had no knowledge of the industry nor parts of the world that have such an important role to play in, turns out, in our global supply chain for medicines. And I stumbled on this subject, and I spent 3 years researching it. And I will say it's done in the public interest. No one paid me to do it. But as you'll see, it was so compelling that I needed to keep going. And I share some of the findings here with you and so many others in the past 2 years. China RX came out in 2018, and it was quite, I look back and it actually predicted what happened with coronavirus. Back then, I wrote that in the event of a global pandemic or natural disaster, the US will wait in line with other countries for critical medicines and their components, and that's exactly what happened. It also predicted back then that the FDA would become increasingly challenged to secure the safety and quality of the medicines that we take and that you as physicians prescribe. And regrettably, that has happened also. So let's jump right in here. I came up with some learning objectives that are focused on this topic. So the first is recognize, where do our generic medicines come from? To understand the root cause of why the US no longer makes generic drugs, These are 90% of the medicines that you as physicians prescribe. I'll talk about the lessons of COVID-19 about global supply chains, and I'm sure members of our panel will have their own experiences that will be tremendously valuable. And then what do we do? What steps do we take at a public policy level, what hospitals and practicing physicians can do? So where did the generics physicians prescribe come from? Let's go back to 1988. I found online a report from Oak Ridge National Laboratory that was an extraordinary document that identified every single antibiotic fermentation plant in the United States. And it documented what was made there, whether it was cephalosporins, penicillins, tetracyclines, and others, the location of those facilities, the contact names, the phone numbers of people who run those plants. It was a remarkable document, and this was part of our nation's emergency preparedness. This is part of a screenshot of a map of where these fermentation plants were located. So we were prepared. What about today? What would it look like? We have virtually no capacity to manufacture antibiotics. These are whether it's for ear infections in children, for bronchitis, strep throat, pneumonia, sepsis, STDs, MRSA, anthrax exposure. We cannot make antibiotics in the United States of America. Turns out we're dramatically dependent on China, not only for the components in antibiotics, but thousands and thousands of other essential generic drugs. How dependent are we? I interviewed a gentleman who's the CEO of a family-owned generic company that has a well-regarded reputation in Europe, who said if China stopped exporting ingredients to the United States, within months, all the pharmacies would be pretty empty. So what did we observe with COVID-19 and generic drugs to care for hospitalized patients? As the coronavirus was coming east from Asia and Europe, I happened to be having dinner with pharmaceutical engineers and chemists who have worked in manufacturing plants, probably a total of the four of them, 150 years. I went around the table at dinner and I said, so let's take some of the essential generic drugs that are needed to care for people hospitalized with coronavirus, like propofol, norepinephrine, azithromycin, hydrocortisone, and others. So if we have to get the raw materials, the starting materials to make them, where are they sourced? We went around the table and everyone, again, 150 years combined experience, said that 90% of the key starting materials to make these essential generic drugs are sourced in China. This is one of the reasons why there were allocation problems and shortages of essential medicines in a global pandemic in the United States and other countries. So how did we get here? There's a fascinating story about how the last US penicillin plant shut down. We can no longer make penicillin. That plant closed. It was a Bristol Myers Squibb plant up in Syracuse, New York. The New York Times reported back in 2004 that the plant was indeed going to close. So why did it close? This is data from a very public-spirited group in Europe. They actually manufacture active ingredients. And we'll get all the nomenclature right for these products and their components. And I apologize for the boxes there. I had to block out the name of the trade association. But this is this bar graph shows the global supply of penicillin fermentation material from the late 80s to mid 2000s. And you can see this global supply increasing over time. I want to call your attention to the sub bars within each bar, like more the purple color bars. And that's China's global market share, which is increasing. And its government did a very smart thing And it invested heavily, at least in the beginning in the 1990s, maybe earlier, in the tremendous infrastructure that's needed to produce antibiotics. And in a country now of 1.3 billion people, that's a very smart thing to do. So they were quite foresighted. I want to draw your attention, and this was an extraordinary finding in China RX. So I read the New York Times article, but it never gave the backstory about why the plant was closing. Well, this data shows it. The yellow line is price. You see price coming down, but look what happened right around 2004. It dropped and it stayed flat for 4 years. It was during that time that the last US penicillin plant shut down. Even India could not compete with China, and it can't make penicillin, which is quite remarkable, especially since India is known as a generic powerhouse. And once Chinese companies gained dominant global market share, prices were increased. This is illegal trade behavior. These are cartels. But nobody was enforcing the law. Nobody was paying attention when this was taking place. And this is a story that's repeated over and over again if you talk to people in the industry, whether in the United States or Europe. We had a vitamin C cartel that the same modus operandi was used, where China dumped ascorbic acid on the global market, kept product low for many years. And we can't make vitamin C anymore in this country. We can't make a number of vitamins. China has dominant global market share. There are some boutique manufacturers, but nothing of any scale. When we talk about losing our capacity to make just penicillin, let alone other antibiotics, I think it's useful to get a sense of what this means. I call it our industrial base. This is an aerial view in the photo at the top of the Bristol-Myers Squibb capability that once made 70% of the raw material for penicillin. And this is what we lost. It's not just demolishing 50 buildings, but the skill, the workforce, the know-how to produce these products that are essential for life. China's dominance is not just in the United States, it's global. I had the pleasure of working with the Dutch Public Television Group in 2019 as the first and only media entity that did a very in-depth story of the impact of centralization of the global supply chain for essential components in generic drugs. And this is a screenshot of a gentleman who worked in the industry in Europe for many, many years in the pharmaceutical industry. And he made a remarkable statement. Not only is Europe dependent on China, we saw this during coronavirus as well. He said, quote, now we're afraid that China will, and this was pre-COVID, now we're afraid that China will do things to deprive us of our medication. And this is not a country that was involved in has been involved in a trade kerfuffle. So there's something else going on here where there are people in the industry who realize and are ready to speak out about the risks of this global dependence. It's like having 90% of the world's oil supply concentrated in a single country, whatever country that is, or 90% of the world's wheat. We just wouldn't do it, but we've done it with our medicines. Many folks have questioned, oh, well, your data is not right, that we're not that dependent on China. My sources have been those who are actually in the manufacturing plants who've been making products for years and years and years. They're not, if I may say, the lobbyists in Washington. And this gentleman said, now you can say that China owns the raw material market worldwide. A counterpart here is, you've probably heard of rare earths, which are used in hybrid cars and windmills and a lot of consumer products. And China has a global chokehold on that. In the same way, they have a chokehold on the key starting materials to make our essential generic drugs and even branded products, even like remdesivir. They make a number of components in remdesivir. This is an effort to try to discern the different parts of our drugs. It's not complete, but it explains some of the terminology. So at the bottom are finished drugs. These are the pills and vials of medicines. And then they're made with active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs. And it's really heartening to see that the term API has now become socialized and amplified on Capitol Hill. If I may say, more than 50 bills have been introduced in Congress as a result of China RX. Now, the FDA regulates these products, the active ingredients and finished drugs. They go into the plants and inspect their facilities in a very state-of-the-art gold standard process. But as you'll hear in a minute, the FDA has basically stopped inspections since early this year, and the implications of that for safety are just exponentially concerning. But then what's been less known is how dependent the world is on China for the key starting materials to make the active pharmaceutical ingredients. And this came out during the coronavirus pandemic when, India and its large generic drug industry, its government announced that it depends on China for 69% of that tip of the triangle. So that illustrates how deeply centralized this global market is. And that poses risks to public health, to security, and certainly and foremost to the care of patients. So how dependent are we? China is rapidly moving up the value chain, or moving down the triangle from core components to finished drugs. They make about 10% of our generic drugs now, and that was achieved in just 10 years, that level of market share. And this certainly increased the risks of greater centralization. Here's some labels of selected generic drugs made in China by its domestic companies and sold in the US. So when you hear about generic drugs and you've got the Generic Drug Association, you think about these US-based companies. That's just simply not true. So here's the antibiotic doxycycline made by a company in China. Here's one making a chemotherapy agent, antidepressants, birth control pills, and on HIV/AIDS medicine, diabetes, metformin. And that list is growing rapidly. And as you'll see in a minute, US manufacturing is collapsing and European manufacturing is collapsing. These are the top 3 Western generic drug companies by sales. You've probably heard of Mylan, based in the US, their headquarters. They announced last year that they were merging with Pfizer. Teva announced it was dropping products. Sandoz said the same thing in early 2019. And this shows the impact of that. This is pre-COVID, where the pharmacists on the panel will know this even better than I, that for 20 years we've had shortages of essential medicines. It's really quite remarkable that we have shortages of anything in this country, let alone these generic drugs. There's lots of reasons for that, but in my view, as someone looking at this from the public interest, it's totally unacceptable. And finally, an entity came along called Civica RX, a consortium of hospitals I'll talk about later, that has basically created a new supply chain to prevent shortages of essential drugs for their members. But here's a couple extra screenshots of drugs in shortage from November 2019, before going into a pandemic. And note the number of products discontinued by Western companies when you see the reason for the shortage. And I apologize for the very small print here, but you can see on the left-hand side is the name of the product. On the right-hand side, product discontinued, manufacturer no longer making, and on and on. And these are just a few pages. It's shocking. It's absolutely shocking that the bottom is falling out, the availability of essential drugs. This is how we went into a pandemic. And here, as I mentioned, about Pfizer and Mylan joining forces. And that same year, Pfizer announced the opening of its global generic headquarters in Shanghai, which appears to be evidence of yet further centralization. So as I mentioned, China makes about 10% of our generic drugs and growing fast. India makes about 25%. But once again, and this was a discovery in China RX, how dependent India is on China for those key starting materials. As I mentioned, about 69% of those raw materials it needs to make its products are sourced from China. And that's one of the reasons India had to impose some export bans on products during the pandemic, because it couldn't get the starting materials from China. Again, India dependent on China at that tip of the triangle. What we saw with COVID-19 was absolutely predictable. Countries will ban exports of essential medicines and other supplies to keep product for their own people. I've heard that Italy banned exports of propofol. One can understand that. And there were shortages of propofol. The UK banned parallel exports. The EU, half of countries in the EU banned exports. So this suggests that we cannot rely on other countries during a pandemic. It suggests that we must have some degree of self-sufficiency for essential drugs, for survival, for public health. On a positive note, India, the EU, Japan, and the US are working to strengthen domestic manufacturing. There's been quite pleasant progress here in the United States. It's slow, but we have to ramp up quickly. And we're going to need substantial investment, public and private sector, to bring back some antibiotic raw material capability. And once again, the centralization of the global supply chain in a single country, whatever it is, poses risk to public health, national security, and frankly, survival. Here's a couple of risk mitigation recommendations. One of the recommendations, and there's a number of recommendations that have actually been in China RX that have been implemented, and it's very heartening to see that. One of the shocking findings I reported in the book is that it's no one's job in the federal government to know who controls the supply of our drugs. We don't do that with oil, we don't do that with food, but we allowed it to happen with things that we need to survive. And so the recommendation was that there be an ongoing review of our vulnerabilities. Where are we sole sourcing? Where are there fragile suppliers? And it's heartening to see that the FDA has done that, and they actually came up with a list of essential drugs. And part of that risk methodology, as I understand it, depends on risk issues of where they're sourced. The Department of Defense has undertaken an effort to identify where it has vulnerabilities. I was very pleased with when a gentleman from Massachusetts, he works in he's a PhD chemist who works in a small biotech company up in your beautiful state, that he read China RX, sent it to his CEO, and was asked to make a presentation to his board. And the board he told me the board made a decision different than what they would have otherwise made, because they had greater clarity on the supply chain and the implications for that company. So that's exactly what we should be doing, looking at our supply chains. For years we didn't do it. We're in the age of Amazon Prime, where you hit a few keystrokes and things magically show up on your door. Well, now we are forced to go back and look at our suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers. It's a very, very long chain. And if you have a global pandemic that starts in the place that is where the manufacturing is so highly centralized, it's a disaster waiting to happen. So all this was predictable, but the good news is that there's movement to try to bring it back, have some domestic capability. One of the recommendations, because we have to come up with solutions for policymakers, and when I testified on Capitol Hill, the Senate Small Business Committee, to the House Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee, and the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, it occurred to me, and this is another recommendation in China RX, that we start with using the money we're already spending as taxpayers in the VA, in the Department of Defense, and even the Strategic National Stockpile, to use that money to give priority to domestic companies, because those domestic companies, either new ones or ones that are still hanging on, to have customers, because that's what you need to have sustainability. And these are products that patients are going to need for many years to come. So that's a way to proceed. And I'm happy to say that a number of bills have been introduced in Congress to do just this. And there was an executive order signed in August to have the DoD, the VA, and the Strategic National Stockpile, HHS, prioritize purchases from domestic companies. I've come to realize the value of advanced manufacturing. We've been making our medicines like we've been making, it was such old technology. We have more advanced manufacturing of potato chips than we do our drugs. And so a recommendation I've made is that we should invest in advanced manufacturing, which is faster, cheaper, a smaller environmental footprint, and real-time quality control. The FDA doesn't have to run around the world to conduct inspections, which are becoming really unviable. And I also recommended that we stockpile API, which lasts longer during pandemics and shortages, and have stand-up facilities to manufacture the finished product, which you can do in a matter of weeks. I've also recommended that we have to do testing of generic drugs to ensure that they are what they're supposed to be. It was surprising to learn that the FDA tests very few products. And it was heartening to see that about 2018 that a company in the Yale Science Park was launched that started testing generic drugs. Because it's clear that the FDA and European Union just can't assure the safety of medicines. And this is an example of what we're facing. This is a report of after an inspection of a plant in China making the core material, key starting material for piperacillin tazobactam. And you can see at the top, statement of non-compliance with what they call GMP, that's good manufacturing practices. And this inspection basically blasted what was going on in this plant. It was completely unacceptable, some very critical concerns. The remarkable thing is that the regulator in Europe, and the same thing happened here, allowed product to still be sold in Europe and the United States because of concerns about shortage, because there's nobody else to make it. This happened back in 2015 when the FDA banned more than 20 products, APIs coming from a plant in China, but exempted many of them from its own ban. These were chemotherapy products and antibiotics. It exempted them from its own ban because of concerns about shortages. And this situation is only going to get worse and worse and worse as we're seeing Western generic companies and manufacturing collapse. So that's the situation with our broken regulatory system. And we really can't assure quality and safety. This is a case study of provided by this entity at the Yale Science Park that's testing it. They're called Valisure. And this is lisinopril. And they tested the brand. You can see it on the x-axis and 5 different generics. And on the y-axis is the active ingredient. And the brand product has about 100% what it should have. And then look at the variation. Look at on the right-hand side. Look at the variation in the product on the right side. I'm told by my pharmacist friends and colleagues that that's still within FDA specification. But is that the kind of medicine you'd like to take? This same company is the one that identified the carcinogens in metformin and identified the impact of Zantac and ranitidine when it enters the body and the carcinogens that were formed. So I have been advocating for independent testing and public reporting of the results. In an ideal sense, I'd love to see a consumer reports type reporting that would change the market overnight. I don't think we'll see that. But the good news is we're beginning to see some companies take testing seriously. But we need to know that every batch is tested. And this company in New Haven tests every batch before they sell it. And I'm told that their primary customers are people who are physicians and those in the pharmaceutical industry. As mentioned, I had the pleasure of testifying before the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission in July of 2019. This was the first public formal exposure of the impact of our dependence and the impact on it. And I'm very, very grateful for that opportunity, because this is not a subject that's easy to get out there in the public forum. And during the hearing where I had the privilege of testifying, there was a gentleman from the Department of Defense who gave very candid testimony about how the risks of dependence on China cannot be overstated, cannot be understated. And during the testimony, there was a retired Army colonel who's a commissioner. He was not there to testify. Extemporaneously spoke up about his own experience with the blood pressure medicine. I'm sure you physicians remember the blood pressure medicine recalls. Beginning in 2018, it was valsartan and the other sartans. And I'll get to the root cause of what happened in the valsartan case. It's a fascinating story. But in the case of this testimony, this retired Army colonel, in 90 seconds, gave spellbinding account of how his own blood pressure medicine was contaminated. It was made in India, but the ingredient came from China, and that was the problem. And it had rocket fuel chemicals in it. And he said, if I'm getting this, then active duty military must be getting it also. And you should have seen that. If we could show the video, the look on his face is just extraordinary. And there were tens of thousands of certainly retired military that got this, and no doubt active duty people, and millions of people in the United States, which caused havoc for so many patients. But just the root cause analysis of what happened with valsartan. How did it become contaminated? What's the backstory? The product was coming off patent. And when that happens, there are a lot of companies that want to get in and get a dominant global market share. So there was a Chinese company that wanted to improve the yield or the efficiency in how that product is produced. And so they turned to a group of chemistry students at a university down the road from their plant. And these chemistry student whiz kids came up with a new chemical process that turned out to be much more efficient and increased yield significantly. And that's what was used to make the valsartan that was indeed the most problematic, the API that was most problematic of all. The amount of carcinogen per pill in the Chinese product was more than 200 times the acceptable limit. And patients were taking this every day. When the FDA finally got in to conduct the inspection, they found records to indicate that the company knew that it was selling a product that did not meet US standards, that was substandard, but sold it anyway. But what happened in the case of this new chemical process, it was great chemistry in terms of efficiency, but no one considered that, in fact, this is product going to be consumed by humans. It's really quite a remarkable backstory. This is not the first time that the United States has had problems with contaminated products. And by the way, the carcinogens, NDMA and others, they went undetected for at least 4 years. And that's a challenge with products when we're not testing them and they are not made in close proximity where we can know the people and understand what's really going on in these plants. Some of you may remember when contaminated heparin appeared beginning in 2007, where at least hundreds of Americans died, probably more. Again, this is a perfect crime in the sense that how do you show cause and effect? How do you show that it was a drug that caused a particular adverse outcome in a patient? This is Dr. Robert Allen. He is a radiologist from Johns Hopkins, went to medical school there, became a radiologist in Scottsdale, had a thriving practice with his family. This is his son, Joshua, on a beautiful day in Arizona. One day, late evening, one night, he went into the Mayo Clinic emergency room for a relatively minor condition, and otherwise healthy 45-year-old gentleman. He was kept overnight, and the following day he got 2 bolus doses of heparin. And according to undisputed records, within 11 minutes, he went into cardiogenic shock and his other organs began to fail. This was in December of 2007. His heart was removed the following week, he was put on an artificial machine. The following month, January 2008, he's sitting up in bed with his wife next to him, tethered to the machine, watching the evening news, and he hears about contaminated heparin found in St. Louis at the Children's Hospital. He turned to his wife and said, "Oh my God, I got a lot of heparin. Was it contaminated?" After 3 months later, with a heroic but Hail Mary of heart transplant, he succumbed after a really horrific experience. And this was a contaminant that was a highly deceptive process. It passed under the radar of common tests used at the time. And the motivation for doing this in China was it was a lot cheaper when there was a shortage of pigs because of blue ear disease. Heparin is made from the intestines, the mucous membranes of pigs' intestines. And disease outbreak, which we had again right before COVID, wiped out such a huge portion of the pig population. So enterprising minds wanted to come up with a fake substitute, and they actually patented it in China. But it turned out in certain dose levels to be lethal. And that's what happened to Dr. Robert Allen. So the detection of very, very serious components in medicines is an extraordinary challenge and great risk to the health of patients, public health, and even our national security. So what can hospitals do? I'm just really delighted to see that Civica RX, it's a consortium of about 1,200 hospitals, started in part by the Mayo Clinic, and they're creating a new supply chain. They're identifying trustworthy companies in trustworthy countries and giving them long-term contracts, paying them a fair price, not a race to the bottom price, and full transparency on country of origin of the API, the finished drug, independent testing. And within a year, they were making available 20 different products to their member hospitals, another 20 the following year. And within 5 years, again, these are essential generic drugs in shortage. Will have 100 products, and they're moving to have fully made essential drugs here in the United States. And Kaiser Permanente just joined them with their 24 million members. And there's nobody else out there doing this. We need a couple Civica RXs. But this is the kind of innovation that we need. And it all comes down to changing what we buy. When I have given grand rounds at prominent hospitals, I ask them, why do you tolerate suppliers who supply you with contaminated product in persistent shortage? It's just unacceptable. And so the solution is, as Civica has shown, is you got to change who's supplying your product. Why would you keep buying, if any household good, if you keep buying defective ones that are often in shortage, you just find a different product or create a new set of manufacturers. So I'm going to stop there, and I would look forward to your questions, your comments, your experiences, and we'll take it from there. Over to you, Mary.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. At this time, I'd like to introduce 3 of our expert panelists who will be commenting on this critical issue. And once again, once we hear from each of the panelists, we will have an audience Q&A, and we already have a number of questions that we have accumulated, so please continue to type in your questions, and Dr. McGee will be moderating the Q&A. So our first expert panelist tonight is Neil Gilchrist, Doctor of Pharmacy. Neil is the Chief Pharmacy Officer at UMass Memorial Medical Center in Worcester. He is responsible for oversight of pharmacy services across the medical center, along with strategic planning and execution of financial, human resource, and operational needs. He currently serves as a member of the Board of Directors for the Massachusetts Society of Health System Pharmacists and a founding Board of Directors member for the Health System-owned Specialty Pharmacy Alliance. His experience in managing critical drug shortages and supply chain challenges will be a great contribution to this topic of discussion. We welcome Neil to present his remarks.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank Rosemary Gibson on an excellent presentation and highlighting a critical topic. I've been closely involved in managing drug shortages for a number of years at the medical center and watching closely a significant and growing concern over quality and sourcing of pharmaceuticals. It's been documented and discussed tonight just the growing concern over the large portion of API that comes from outside of the United States, primarily sourced in China and India. Within the United States, we've seen some steps forward with quality control in the pharmaceutical supply chain, but it's really focused on ensuring counterfeit medications do not get introduced through a regulation called the Drug Supply Chain and Security Act. But we're really missing the visibility and transparency from the manufacturing and sourcing of API step. We've seen a number of instances where the U.S. supply chain has been challenged by the lack of transparency in manufacturing and sourcing. Most notably during Hurricane Maria in 2017, we saw a national shortage of IV saline as well as nutritionals that were manufactured in Puerto Rico. And many of us in healthcare scrambled to try to understand what other medications were manufactured there so that we could respond, and that information is considered proprietary. We manage drug shortages in healthcare now very effectively and probably too efficiently, really becoming part of our normal operations. But I don't believe any of this could have prepared us for the pandemic and the demand on supply that we would ensue over the several months as we surged in early 2020. But still surprising is how we managed to get through the pandemic and not run out of these critical meds is still unknown, but as we know, there was large demands. We also observed the restrictions that were put on by countries, in particular India put a restriction on over 20 medications, but we were unsure of what those medications were, just that the FDA was watching those closely. In the book China RX, I found the 10-step plan to bring it home towards the end, really excellent points of discussion and application with our healthcare system. The first is around increased testing of medications. There is an Office of Pharmaceutical Quality that was established in 2015 under the FDA and Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And this office has invested quite a bit of resources into FDA staff dedicated to pharmaceutical quality, assessment of application of medications to ensure drug shortages don't occur, and really development of advanced and sensitive tests, such as for nitrosamine compounds and making that testing available. But as highlighted tonight, it still is not enough. At UMass Medical Center, we've put in place emergency operations supply program for critical medications and a structure for the management of drug recalls and shortages. Healthcare systems need to have a continuous monitoring of these recalls and shortages to be able to react more rapidly to these events to protect our patients and provide our clinicians with clinical decision support in our electronic records. Another important point is making sure we have traceability down to the patient level so that if these recalls occur, such as in an instance of heparin, that we know which patients receive those. We really need to leverage our health records. We've seen significant recalls in the past few years, as mentioned, around nitrosamine impurities. That's a carcinogen, with angiotensin receptor blockers and metformin. What I would also note is that the FDA has also posted a statement on not recalling a drug, rifampin, used for tuberculosis that has been noted to have elevated nitrosamine levels, but it's not recalled because if they recalled it, there would be a national shortage of the drug. Second point is consider medications as a strategic asset. As healthcare systems, we move our purchasing around through group purchasing organizations. And are we contributing to this problem by not committing longer term contracts to these manufacturers and invest time in understanding where they're sourcing from? And so we need to look a little bit closer at how we contract for supplies and medications. And then last is just prioritizing a list of medications for which a supply interruption poses an immediate danger to public health, as a recommendation by Rosemary. So last month, the FDA published a list of over 200 essential medications and 96 critical devices. This is an important first step, and we need to dig deeper down to where the drugs and the API is sourced from. but nonetheless, it's still a starting point to see this move forward. At UMass Medical Center, we have reviewed this critical list of medications and incorporated into our emergency operations supply. So I appreciate the invitation to provide comments on tonight's topic and look forward to the question and answer section. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Ross Thompson. Ross is the Vice President and Chief Pharmacy Officer at Tufts Medical Center and the Tufts Children's Hospital in Boston. Ross is also Assistant Professor of Medicine at Tufts University and Clinical Assistant Professor at Northeastern University School of Pharmacy. In his current role at Tufts Medical Center, Ross oversees pharmacy services within this 451-bed academic medical center, providing a full complement of adult and pediatric care. The Department of Pharmacy consists of 225 full-time equivalents and an operating budget of $125 million. Services consist of an integrated practice model in support of acute care, satellite-based pharmacy services for 2 infusion centers, clinic-based ambulatory practices, and 3 outpatient pharmacies, including a specialty pharmacy service center. He is an active member of the Mass Society of Health System Pharmacists, having served as treasurer, a director on the board, and is president. Ross is also active in the American Society of Health System Pharmacists, having served as vice chair of the section for pharmacy practice managers and as a member of the Council on Administrative Affairs and the Council on Pharmacy Management. Welcome, Ross, to give your remarks.
Thank you, Mary, and thanks everyone for the interest in this topic. Rosemary did a fabulous job at the time of publishing this book that really, I think, did a nice job of raising everybody's awareness to the issues, including myself. I don't know that even those close to it realize the extensiveness of the problem. So thank you for that. I would echo many of the comments that Neil just made, but maybe I can share a little bit more specifics of things that are going on at Tufts Medical Center. And I've now been in this role for about 12 years. In the early days, I remember talking about drug shortages and disruptions in the supply chain being the end of maybe the last 5 or 10 minutes of our weekly management team discussions. And we could usually get through what we needed to talk about in 5 or 10 minutes. Today, we now have a committee of approximately 15 people from various disciplines and areas of specialty that come together on a weekly basis, and they talk about what they've been working on over the course of the week, so that they come to this committee to actually action what they've studied and determined would be necessary to avoid any negative impact to the care that we provide for our patients. I describe it a lot to say we don't like to bother our providers. We don't like to communicate about drug shortages. And when we do our jobs really well, we're able to move things around such that we don't have to communicate the shortage. What our medical staff doesn't appreciate is how many times we come so close to being in a crisis, and we're able to just barely avert it by managing utilization, by managing some type of formulary substitution, therapeutic substitution, and we're able to kind of keep things moving without there being a direct disruption to the care that we provide for our patients. Neil commented on Hurricane Maria. We certainly felt the impact of that, and the thing that we learned there was nobody really knew what was being manufactured in Puerto Rico. We were all surprised that had such a negative impact on the availability of IV solutions. But we didn't know what else was there. And it took us a while to figure out what products were being manufactured in Puerto Rico that now, we kind of had to wait for the other shoe to drop to realize what other shortages we would be managing. The FDA takes pride in their progress that they report publicly about the number of drug shortages that they've been able to avert. I think not mistaken, I think it was 2010 was the height of drug shortages that were being reported by the FDA, where they were to the tune of 200, 220 drug shortages reported in that year. And more recently, they talk about there being 50 to 55 new drug shortages reported per year. I would say when we think about the raw number, that's one thing. But when we think about it more from a heat index perspective, it feels a lot hotter than 55 drug shortages. And COVID-19 was a great example where I remember some of our early planning was there's a crisis brewing in China. What are our vulnerabilities? The first thought that went through my mind was, well, there's short-term vulnerabilities for the finished product that come from China. And those might be things that we need to worry about in the 3 to 6 month horizon. But then I thought about all of the raw ingredient, all the API that comes from China, and the consequences of that maybe 6 or 9 months down the road when those ingredients weren't getting passed to the manufacturers that actually create the final product. So I think that FDA is making steps, but I think as Rosemary outlined, there are so many factors where the economics are kind of stacked against us that buying cheap and buying what's available is not putting us on a path of having all the redundancies and security that we really need. So thank you.
Thank you. So our final expert panelist is Dr. Soumya Viswanathan. Soumya is the Chief Medical Officer for Tenet Healthcare's Massachusetts and South Carolina markets. In her current role as the Group CMO of Tenet Healthcare, she leads all Tenet hospitals based in Massachusetts. She is also a Harvard University instructor and Program Director for Executive and Continuing Professional Education. Here in Worcester, she is the CMO of St. Vincent's Hospital. With over 15 years of experience in leadership roles, such as Regional CMO, Chief ACO Officer, Physician-in-Chief, and Physician Quality Officer, Dr. Viswanathan has worked with larger regional health systems and academic medical centers. We welcome Dr. Viswanathan to give her remarks.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much. I wanted to first applaud Rosemary Gibson's presentation, just superb presentation. And it's really also quite difficult to follow the expert speakers who are ahead of me because as the panelists, just great expert opinion on the pharmaceutical tangent that is spinning all of us in a tizzy fit because a lot of the things that have been said today are just coming so close to heart. I want to start off actually by talking a little bit. I'm an internal medicine doctor by profession. I do have the leadership role, but I'm a clinician as well. So I wanted to just bring a couple of anecdotes to the forefront so that it really impresses upon all of us, the importance of what we are discussing today before I take I take the conversation towards what my thoughts are about what has been already discussed. The one anecdote that comes to mind is one of our hospitals. We have excellent cardiology and cardiac surgery services there, excellent quality cardiac surgery. So during procedures, vascular and cardiac surgery procedures, we use a machine called a cell saver machine, which basically is a way of purifying a lot of the blood products as we are giving it back to the patient post-operatively or perioperatively. There was a time where within a span of 1 week, we had pretty much 80% or close to that, the number of patients who had undergone surgery who had to return to the operating room because they had unusual bleeding from the site of surgery. This is usually recorded as a critical event, and it's, many of them did not get to the point of reportability, but it was at a point where we had to do an investigation to find out what happened. So we were initially thinking there was a problem with the cell saver machine, but it turned out that it was not cell saver machine. It was more of a product that was used in the cell saver machine called heparin. And none of the patients had any kind of allergic reaction to heparin or anything like that. So it was the product itself. So the investigation is still going on to figure out what else happened during that incident and during that week where those patients had unusual bleeding that was noted that they had to go back to the operating room. These are instances that rings a bell in my head, when I think about actual anecdotes, actual scenarios that occurred where we have to actually look at the drug and say, where did this come from? The second scenario that has been occurring in most of our hospitals is the current pandemic. When we were in peak surge in Massachusetts, we actually had to pause on a couple of days where we were doing counts, and we have been keeping counts of everything, including our stockpiles of medications, alongside with how many ventilators do we have, how many beds do we have, all that, which was being reported to DPH. But we had to look at our stockpiles of propofol. We had to look at our stockpiles of steroids, of Decadron, of remdesivir. This was when we were in peak surge, the first time around. And it was sad when there were days where we said, we are running so low, and what is the alternative? Never thought that day would come, where basic medications that patients should be getting, and we are saying, why are we running short? Is it because the rest of the country is taking it, or is it because we're not getting the supply? And when all these questions came to mind, it was a little sad to note that we were actually referencing shortage in medication because we were not getting those supplies from where we should be getting them, from other countries. So it brings home a couple of important points. A couple of decades ago, where United States and Europe and Japan had all the pharmaceutical ingredients that they were supplying to the rest of the world. And that whole chart has flipped. And I think Rosemary Gibson aptly pointed out, it's now concentrated in one country, which is China, is holding the card to supply all the ingredients, pharmaceutical ingredients, to the rest of the world. So this brings up a couple of important questions, which I think most of us have discussed. One is just the speed and the efficiency with which they are able to manufacture these. So they get the ingredients, they wait for the other countries to really package everything, make sure we have done the trial and error, make sure we have done all the research and everything. And then they take the ingredients, package the whole thing, put the jigsaw puzzle together, and sell it back to the same countries as a completed jigsaw puzzle. The question is, what do we have as an alternative? If we are going to shy away from this and we want to put a stop to it, I think we need to have the same speed and efficiency to figure out where are we going to do this locally. And I think that's where we need everybody's help, because the landscape is such that the providers, the payers, and the patients have to come together. And I'm speaking about this from a payer perspective as well, because payment reforms need to come forward to say, okay, we are not going to charge exorbitant amounts for brand name medication, which are being manufactured here, versus generic, which will be cheaper for patients. Because as a clinician, that's what we encounter. The patients will come to us and say, can I get a generic because it costs less? And even though I would want to present and I would want to go forward with a brand name, their insurance does not cover it. So there's a lot of mingling of payers, providers, and patients that have to come together to make this happen. From a federal government agency, the federal government has to make some move towards really figuring out how they are going to support smaller biotech companies that sometimes get chewed up by monster biotech companies. They have to support all kinds of programs such as these. And we have to figure out how we are going to move forward at a local level for manufacturing the raw ingredients so that we can make our own drugs. The second piece, and I'll end with that, is definitely the concern about drug safety. if the FDA inspectors, and thank you, Rosemary, for pointing this out in your China RX book, but basically, you know, it's really revealing how the FDA inspectors who are stationed in various countries to really regulate as the ingredients are coming back or the finished product is coming back to our country, if they are not going to be allowed to really monitor the medications that are being produced in China, that is going to be a huge problem. And we need to figure out how FDA can ramp up their processes, have either more people who are going to be monitoring this, or really looking at, should we be giving stamping a finished product manufactured in USA stamp, or should we be saying manufactured in USA, but ingredients coming from such and such countries? So there is transparency on where the ingredients are being manufactured and people can choose at that point. I think there is a lot of discussion which can go on, and we are really looking forward to the Q&A session because I'm sure many of you are thinking along the same lines as we all are. And thank you very much for giving this opportunity to be on this expert panel. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Over to you, Mary and Dr. McGee.
Yep. All right. Thank you very much to our panelists and to Rosemary. This is really a wonderful discussion today. We've gotten several interesting questions and a few things which perhaps we could highlight that were covered. But we can start with Rosemary on this. Can a physician or a patient find out where their drugs are manufactured or where their ingredients are sourced?
In some small number of cases, they can. There is a website hosted by the National Library of Medicine, which is part of the NIH. It's called Daily Med, M-E-D. And you type in the name of your product, and what will come up are different producers of that product. And a number of those results, you can see photos of the labels of the drug. Mm. The ones that I showed you, the labels from the ones coming from China, those are from the Daily Med website.
Okay.
Now, the second thing I've done, and some companies were willing to share country of origin information, but many were not. And I say those that don't want to share where their product is made. You know, I'd be proud of where I'd want to make something. If you don't want to tell, then that tells me you've got a problem. Mm-hmm. You don't want to tell your customers. But that's where you can try. Okay. And just call them up.
I think this is one of the recommendations. It's a very sensible one that shouldn't be that hard to accomplish from the point of view of regulation. When we go into a car dealer, we can look on the sticker on a car and find out what % of the parts were made in what country, but we can't find that out about our meds.
There was a bill introduced about 11 years ago, and it was killed, before it got anywhere.
Now, another thing is the FDA does what amounts to process inspections, and they do them in the United States, they do them around the world, but there are differences in what they are capable of doing. Can you just give us a contrast between an FDA inspection in the United States and an FDA inspection in China?
Yes. When the FDA goes to other countries, they're basically visitors, and they have to inform the government in advance that they're coming. And so that gives advance notice to companies so they can clean up. Whereas here, if an FDA inspector goes into a plant, tomorrow morning, they can just walk right in without any advance notice. Mm-hmm. The in-depth nature of the inspections in the U.S., I'm told by those who've gone through these inspections, great manufacturing people, they're very intensive and can be quite long. Whereas in China, the FDA has trouble hiring and finding people who want to go to some of these countries like China to do inspections.
Mm. So they have a staff.
It's grueling, and plus you have the translation issue, the culture issue. They go in and they want to get out fast. And now, of course, nobody's going. And the State Department actually issued a warning this past summer and fall that, and I heard this from others, that it's becoming pretty hostile. And there's warnings about Americans traveling there that they could be banned from exiting. So I think the days of FDA on-site inspections in certain countries is really coming to a close.
And pre-COVID, was there a backlog in inspections?
Oh, I think so. Absolutely. And, the FDA stopped, they would not give visas to FDA employees who were hired to go work in an office in China.
Okay. And then since COVID, what has happened?
Well, the FDA recalled all of its inspectors around the world, and it's going to be a long time before they get back. I think they've tried to start some inspections back here in the U.S. Maybe Neil Ross might have some intel on that, but it's just not being inspected.
Okay. And is there questions about the relative safety of drugs from different countries? There's a lot of talk about, for example, buying your drugs in Canada or the like. Are the products from one manufacturer essentially the same regardless of the country it is sold in?
I think so. With the valsartan, for example, that very bad API with 200 times the acceptable limit of carcinogen NDMA, that was sold in more than 20 countries.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Getting to our panelists, this whole issue of COVID, I think, has put in contrast the pressures to be efficient and the need for capacity for an emergency. This goes beyond drugs, but can, at least from a pharmaceutical point of view, give us an idea as to what the thought process is within your institution of, on the one hand, trying to be efficient, and on the other hand, being prepared for what might happen?
Dale, I'd be happy to start that off, and then maybe Neil can augment. So in our organization, we were obviously watching what was going on in Italy and then Seattle, and understanding what the treatment guidelines would be, and trying to anticipate what medications would be needed, perhaps in higher demand. So we put a list of medications together and started to try to accumulate a bit of a buffer of inventory, just in anticipation of whatever was coming at us. There was twists and turns, and what the treatment guidelines were. They were kind of evolving as they were coming at us. But what we tried to do is basically say, if we were completely shut off from the supply chain, it got completely exhausted, what would we need to treat our current ICU population for 30 days? We tried to do some fancy math and come up with some targets of what we should have available. As we got into it, what we didn't realize was, to prone a patient, the actual treatment that we were providing for these patients, we were consuming 6 to 10 times the dosages of medication that we would typically use to treat an ICU patient. So we quickly got into trouble in areas such as sedatives and analgesics. And so it required us to kind of scramble. Had we not tried to build a buffer, we absolutely would have run out of inventory. The other thing that helped us actually was canceling of elective procedures where some of these medications are used. So we were basically able to divert that typical utilization pattern to manage what we had in our ICUs.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments from the others?
Sure, I can add some additional comment there as well. And for being in Massachusetts, we all and everyone across the country that's in healthcare remembers the New England compounding crisis and meningitis outbreak. So within New England, in the pharmacy world, we're very adverse to using companies that compound some of our medications, such as fentanyl drips and midazolam drips, starting with a raw product API that's not sterile, and then they sterilize it. That was really the big problem with that compound in pharmacy. And so I was very concerned from the beginning with regards to quality control, because we no longer could get supply from these compounders of sterile to sterile compounding. And so we had to work closely with our group purchasing organization to vet appropriately new compounders across the country, and every healthcare system did this, to make sure that we were sourcing from legitimate suppliers and that they had the appropriate quality controls in place, so that we could be ensured that we were not going down the path of introducing any additional harm. I look at our pharmacy buyers as almost like stockbrokers, where they're, to Ross's point, they're looking at supply and shifting and pivoting all throughout the day to try to get additional supply. And then the last point I would make is that we also work closely on predictive modeling. A lot of folks looked at ventilator demand and patient surge. We laid our medication demand on top of that predictive modeling for ventilators, so that we could help and see where those points would be that we would run out of one medication and have to adjust to another group. So thank you.
Okay, great. There is another question dealing with how long this has been a problem. I think there's sometimes a temptation to get a little political here, and I want us to avoid that. But would you say, perhaps Rosemary would be the appropriate one to address this, would you say this is an issue that has popped up over the past few years, or is it long-standing?
Yeah, you know what's interesting is I was sitting at the same desk where I am now and put the pieces together one evening. And it turns out when the United States opened up free trade with China in 2000, and what that means is tariffs on products coming in from China were dramatically reduced. I put that together within 2 years. That's when we lost our last vitamin C ascorbic acid plant. That's 4 years. That's when we lost the last penicillin plant. Within 2 years, we lost the last aspirin plant. So there's no doubt that the opening up of free trade with China made products cheaper here, their products cheaper here. And Dee, I want to bring up a point. I've been looking at the questions. You know, people say, well, it costs more to make them here. And 2 points on that. And this was told to me by a gentleman who's been making drugs for like 35 years. He's been in the plants, built plants. And he went out to buy a 90-day supply of, I think, lisinopril. And he went to one retail place, and he said the price of that 90-day supply was $157.50. And he said, guess how much the manufacturer would be paid for that? And I said, well, $20. And if we had a polling here, I'd ask people to put in, you know, how much they think the manufacturer would get paid $1. And so where does the other $156 go? This is also contributed on our side here to the collapse of Western manufacturing. That's why we need to buy product differently. And also advanced manufacturing, there's great capability that's emerging here in the United States, and they can make products 30-40% cheaper using technology that's used in the chemical industry, because after all, pharmaceuticals is a chemical process. And the federal government provided some funding to jumpstart that. We can make them much, much cheaper here. But then again, we also have to, you know, pay a fair price, not a race to the bottom price. And we can be self-sufficient and not have these shortages.
Okay. Well, I mean, you hint at another thing, and that is there are so many people involved in the supply chain. It is at one level, it is the raw materials, the active ingredients, the excipients, which is the funny word, and then the final manufacturers. And then from there, we're dealing with these benefit managers, the wholesalers, the pharmacies and the like. And so there are so many layers that are going on here. Who has bargaining power? If you know, what I'm hearing from the hospital representatives is they're really having trouble just trying to scratch to get supplies and to get things, keep their cabinets full. But who can make the demands? Where is the consumer in this equation that can improve the market?
I think those of us here, you as physicians and us as patients, we have no leverage. But that's why I really appreciate what Civica has done. You've got hospitals that have decided that, as Dr. You said beautifully, the anecdotes of really poor quality drugs. It's not working. It's broken now, and it's been broken for 20 years. And these 1,200 hospitals, as part of Civica, have said, we're going to just blow this up. We're going to identify trustworthy companies, manufacturers, to produce product for us. So they're creating a whole new set of suppliers. And Civica says, and I have no financial ties with these folks, they're a nonprofit. They said that their hospitals saved money during the shortages, and they didn't have shortages of critical drugs. But those decisions happen way up in the boardrooms of hospitals, whether or not they want to stick with a terribly, and my heart goes out to Neil and Ross, and it does, and your colleagues in the pharmacy profession. If I may say, the American Pharmacists Association were so sweet. They gave me an award for this work. They were really kind of out there. And my heart breaks for you. I mean, it's insane. You're talented people, and you have to go chase down stuff. And your anecdote of what it was, years ago with 5-10 minute meeting now to this. I mean, it's insane that the federal government has a whole list of stuff in shortage. How to fix a shortage is what you do in any broken market. You use your money and you pay people to provide you with a quality product at a fair price. And you use your bargaining power. And that's what has to be done. But there's a lot of, reasons why people find it lucrative. It's where that $156.50 is going for that 90-day supply of lisinopril. It's billions and billions of dollars, and people want to protect that.
So the market moved overseas because the manufacturing costs drop. I don't see the cost of pharmaceuticals being on anyone's bargain list. Yeah. You're basically describing the fact that the gap there was recaptured by the intermediaries.
Well, if you and I want to make a higher margin, higher profitability, what we would look is for cheaper sources of places that want to make them. And by the way, not test them, which I just think is absolutely unacceptable. But I think people now are waking up to the risks of that. And I say this publicly, that without FDA inspections, companies that are signing the contracts, supplying and distributing them, and the hospitals that prescribe that, give them to their patients, you're on notice that these are basically unregulated products. And this is putting you at risk, your organizations, if there's a problem with these things, if you're not doing your due diligence.
Okay.
That's a tough message, but it's true. And I know so many great people in the profession who can't say it, but I can say it because nobody pays me to do this work.
I think we need to leave our attendees with perhaps some action steps. I think we've energized them.
Sure.
The looks of the questions. And you've mentioned the fact that many pieces of legislation have been introduced that try to address this problem. Yep. Is over the short run, is there something you would recommend we pay some attention to?
Sure, and I do this on a bipartisan basis because to me this is not one side or the other. And you're in Massachusetts. It just so happens that Senator Elizabeth Warren has a bill that actually has some good provisions for Buy American for essential drugs, and there are Republicans that also have very similar provisions. So I think we've really got to get together on that. And I also want to pick up on the anecdotes that were shared by the wonderful doctor, that as clinicians, keep your eyes and ears open. If a patient says something's not working or if a patient isn't doing well, regrettably, we have to ask the question now, is it the drug? I spoke to a cardiologist at a very prominent hospital, and patients post-heart surgery, he said patients were not doing well, and he had the product tested and it wasn't dissolving properly in the body. That's a very, very serious problem. So I think we have to encourage testing. And I have no financial interest in Valisure, but I'll tell you the fact that they test every batch before they sell it, that should be industry standard to build trust for consumers and patients, for doctors, for pharmacists. Because we're betting our lives on it. So those are two things from a policy level and also for you as clinicians.
Okay.
What to look out for.
Okay. We are getting to the end of our time, and to our panelists, Somaya Viswanathan, Neil Gilchrist, Ross Thompson, thank you so much for joining us this evening. You've added a lot to the discussion, and we really appreciate your taking the time to be with us. Rosemary Gibson, this was a spectacular presentation. I am sure it's opened a lot of eyes and provided a lot of information for people. And I'm really grateful that you've been able to take the time to present to us this evening.
Can I say, Dale, I want to thank you for being open-minded and wanting to hear this. And I will offer to everybody that, I do this because once you see it, we have to do something. And if there's opportunities for me to present on this, this way, now and in the future, you have my email address. I would be honored to do it because we have to fix this. And together we can do it.
Excellent. I really appreciate your taking the time with us this evening. Thank you very much, and good night to everyone.